Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. And just a reminder that the first conversation we're going to have in today's episode may include some details that you find distressing. So please bear that in mind. And the story we're going to talk about is the death of Henry Nowak. He was an 18-year-old student who was stabbed to death after a night out in Southampton by a man called Vickrum Digwa, who was sentenced to a life sentence yesterday at Southampton Crown Court, serving a minimum of 21 years behind bars. And it's not just the details of the sentence or the court case that has gripped people today. It is some footage released by Hampshire Police from a police officer's body-worn camera that shows how the police responded in the moment when they attended the 999 call, where Vickrum Digwa is lying and saying that he has been the victim of a racial attack by Henry Nowak. And Henry Nowak is lying on the ground outside a house, and he is bleeding to death from the stab wounds he's received. And the police don't really appear to believe him when he says that he has been stabbed. And then the really chilling moment when you watch that footage is you realise those are the last few minutes of Henry Nowak's life. And there have been lots of quite powerful reactions from people across the political spectrum, powerful for different reasons, that we're going to go into right now. So, to help us pick our way through this very difficult story, we're joined from Millbank, the BBC's HQ at Westminster, by Joe Pike. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Adam.
And here in the studio with me is Lucy Manning, BBC News special correspondent. Hi again, Lucy.
Hi, Adam.
Right, let's start with this body cam footage. Why, Lucy, are we seeing it in the first place at all?
Well, I think let's start by saying that it's quite clear, having watched it, and I think if other people will have watched it, this is some of the most distressing body cam footage that people will have seen. And politicians have been reacting to it as pretty much the same way that journalists have as well. I think you saw today when people were talking about it, they look quite tearful about it. People haven't wanted to watch it, and that's understandable. But it was released by the police with permission of the family.
In court cases, the body cam footage nowadays becomes an important piece of evidence. So it's shown in open court, isn't it? It's part of the evidence that the jury are looking at that helps them.
Yeah, that's right. And the rules have been over a long period of time now to try and release as much footage that is shown in court at the end of a case, sometimes during it, but mostly at the end of it. So when this case finished, that could be released, but something that's sensitive really has to be cleared with the family. And it is extremely distressing footage. It shows what happened essentially in the last few minutes of Henry Nowak's life. He's on the ground, the officers arrive, his murderer is standing there lying, saying to police, he pulled off my turban and
attacked me.
And Henry is on the ground trying to get the words out, I've been stabbed.
But you can hear, because he's so badly injured, even that is very hard for him to do. It's very garbled and muffled.
Yeah, you can see he's fighting for his life. He doesn't really have the strength to say what's happened to him. He manages to tell them that he's been stabbed. He manages 9 times to say, I can't breathe. And the officers, frankly, are pretty dismissive of him. When he says, I've been stabbed, one officer turns around and says, oh, I don't think so, mate.
Yeah.
And the judge did talk about in his words that it was dark, it was hard to see. But there's certainly a sense that Henry is not believed and he's put into handcuffs.
Yeah, I found it quite helpful today reading the judge's sentencing remarks from the court last week, because I hadn't read it at the time. I only read it today when it became so huge in the last 24 hours. And yeah, it's a quite useful summary of just all the events that led up to this and then what happened. So, for example, the fact that Henry was walking home, he'd been in the pub, but he was well below the drink drive limit,
right,
just as a sort of like a way of testing how much he'd had to drink. He met Vickrum Digwa sort of in the streets. They had some kind of altercation that involved Henry getting his phone out and filming it, and Vickrum Digwa taking it, and then there being a scuffle to get the phone back, and then that's when the stabbing happened.
Yeah, these two didn't know each other, and it's quite clear from what was said in court that Digwa had this what is said to be a ceremonial knife, but was much larger than the Sikh ceremonial knife. And Henry is heard saying, you're a bad man, something along those lines, and then he's stabbed. And Digwa's family call the police and say that it's been a racial attack. And when the police,
you hear them saying that,
yeah, you hear the 999 call that was released as well.
Yeah.
And then when the police turn up, Digwa again lies and says he took my turban off, he attacked me, and the whole way through, the assumption is that the police are believing him against Henry, who is on the ground and who is clearly severely injured.
Let's hear a little bit of that body cam footage. And this is just a little snippet in case you've not heard it and you want to get a bit of a sense of what's going on. And we're playing the absolute bare minimum because it is very hard to listen to and to watch.
What's happened to you, all right?
Been stabbed.
You've been stabbed? Whereabouts? Don't think you have, mate.
And reading the judge's remarks, which were published yesterday, he tries to go into some detail about what he thinks was happening there.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about it was dark and it was difficult for the officers to see and it was difficult for them to know what was going on. But I think others have pointed out that what is clear is that there was a man in distress on the ground saying he'd been stabbed. And the officers say, one of the officers says, well, we'll need to check. But nobody appears to do any proper checks and nobody appears to give him any first aid, and it's only sort of taken seriously right at the end when it's too late. And obviously this will all be investigated. There is now a police watchdog investigation. Only part of that police body cam has been released and they will go through all that. They will interview the officers. They're saying they're treating the officers as witnesses at the moment. That may change. So there is a whole investigation to be done. But from this body-worn camera, from the few minutes that we've seen, it does appear that what you might expect officers to do, which is try and find out what's going on, that assumptions have been made beforehand.
Because I'm just thinking about when we do our first aid training for when we're going to dangerous places. And one of the things you're taught is that when you're presented with the casualty, you're meant to do a really thorough search under their clothes if need be, like rip their clothes off and do it multiple times because it's so easy to miss quite serious injuries.
Yeah, I mean,
when you're in a bit of chaos. And there's no evidence from the footage we've seen of the officers really doing that, apart from at the very end of the video when a female police officer says we should at least give it a go.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we were talking about in the office today, that you are supposed to, if there are injuries to a body, possible stab wounds, you are supposed to feel and check and open the clothes and all that sort of thing. And it didn't appear that was being done, and not helped by Digwa in the background saying he hasn't been stabbed. So there was very much that sense of the police being told one thing and them believing it without necessarily doing that further investigation.
And then, Joe, just to clarify the timeline of all of this. So the initial incident was in December last year. The guilty verdict in Southampton Crown Court was on Thursday, and then the sentencing was yesterday, which is now why politicians feel that they can talk about this.
Absolutely, as well as them all having watched that video, which is, as Lucy said, has prompted very similar reactions in politicians and journalists, and I'm sure all newscasters too. What's interesting about the political reaction is that, yes, some are talking about the sentence handed out to Vickrum Digwa, a life sentence, but a minimum of 21 years, whether that should be increased, and the Attorney General is reviewing it, may refer it to the Court of Appeal. But there's a second question over whether the laws around carrying knives for religious reasons should be changed. And the major debate, the most high-profile debate over the past few hours, has been over whether the police officers involved displayed some form of racial bias. Certainly both the Conservatives and Reform UK have today spoken of two-tier policing. And I spoke earlier to Chris Philp, the Conservative Shadow Home Secretary, about what he thinks had actually happened there. And he said the way the officers handled the matter was a result of an ideology now embedded in training. He said there were programs and practices which promote the idea of ethnic minority victimhood and allow different races to be treated differently. Now, Number 10's view is there is no two-tier policing in the UK, and this tragedy shouldn't be used to divide communities. But what I thought was most interesting about Keir Starmer's interview in the last hour or so, Adam, was that he did say there are serious questions over how that racism accusation, the original call to police being that there had been somebody had been racially abused, how that informed how the police acted.
Well, let's listen to some of what Keir Starmer was saying. He was talking to journalists just before we started recording this episode of Newscast at about 6 p.m. And this is one of those pool interviews where one person is asking him questions on behalf of everyone. And here is that bit of the interview that Joe was just referring to there.
I have seen the body cam footage. It's harrowing. And I have to say, as a father of a 17-year-old boy, I felt sick watching it. It is absolutely right that the IOPC are looking at this. There are clearly serious questions that need to be addressed, not least how accusations of racism informed the decision-making in this case. But my thoughts, I'm sure the thoughts of everybody in the country, are with Henry's family. His life has been stolen, and they are understandably devastated, and that is where I start on this.
Yeah, quite emotional sounding Keir Starmer there. Joe, yeah, I'm really struck by your point that actually there's a parallel world where Keir Starmer would have said all the things about how terrible the crime is, how we've got to think about the family, how terrible it is that Henry's had his life stolen from him, a very vivid way of putting it. But actually there was a world where Keir Starmer might not have lent quite so far into the two-tier policing anti-white racism allegations.
Absolutely. And also, Adam, I'd watched that interview. I'd not just heard it on its own for just the audio. And I hadn't noticed the tone in his voice, which is quite unlike Starmer. You can pick up real emotion, which I think is indicative of how a lot of politicians have reacted today. I think it's also worth making the point that that this is so sensitive and so difficult. But the judge did, and I was quite surprised seeing this towards the end of the sentencing, as Lucy touched on, he made so many arguments explaining the police's approach, and then said at the end he thought the police officer was doing his best in a very difficult situation. That's obviously not the view of Henry Nowak's family, who said they thought the treatment of Henry Nowak was, quotes, shocking. But it does show there are clearly quite different views of the approach and views of the justification and what might have been behind it, even though we should point out that the pathologist was sadly very clear that no emergency medical treatment would have permitted access to the bleeding vein after that stabbing, and therefore effectively there was no chance of survival, however quickly first aid had been received or CPR had been received or even expert medical treatment.
And Lucy, Keir Starmer there referred to something you'd said earlier on about the Independent Office of Police Conduct who are investigating this. Do we know anything more about that process?
So the police watchdog are looking into this. We know that one officer has already resigned from involved in this, has resigned from the force. I think 3 officers involved are still serving. There's been some concern about other officers who on social media have been wrongly identified as being involved in this. And the Home Secretary, when she was in the House of Commons, said that one officer had to be moved from their house because they'd been wrongly identified.
And they were receiving death threats.
Yeah, that's right. So the police watchdog will carry out a robust investigation into this, looking at all the material. It's likely to take a few months. And the family obviously want answers. They spoke outside court yesterday saying that they wanted answers. And I think where we're left on this is obviously, as Joe touched on, the reactions from the politicians showing real emotion. The Prime Minister saying how he felt sick having seen this. And yes, it's footage that has shocked the whole country. But behind all this is obviously a family that wants answers. And the Nowak family said that Henry hadn't been allowed to die with dignity. And but they were quite clear that they didn't want this to foment further division in the country.
And Joe, you referred to Nigel Farage because he did what he described as an address to the nation this morning, which was actually a video that he posted on social media, and he used incredibly strong language.
He certainly did. It was on Twitter, on X, sort of a live broadcast this morning. He said, the accusation of a racial slur was treated more seriously than an act of murder. And he also said we're living in a two-tier culture in this country where the rights and privileges of white people matter less than those of ethnic minorities. He talked about the DEI agenda, was also linking all of this to more common reform arguments around mass immigration. He seemed to be, I read it, I don't know what you thought, Adam, it seemed to be implying that police were acting with racial bias. Camille Badenoch, she disagreed with Nigel Farage today, saying this is not about him, it's about Henry Nowak. But she also did say something has gone very horribly wrong with policing. She spoke about an overcorrection. And actually that was a sort of term that Shabana Mahmood also used in the Commons later in the day. And what was fascinating, I suppose, is that those two parties on the right were disagreeing on this, but actually at the heart of their arguments in terms of what could actually change is a view that some of the training they believe is wrong. And they point, in particular the Tories, to the police anti-racism commitment from the National Police Chiefs Council, and that commitment, which talks of producing equality of policing outcomes for people, is very problematic because it's not about policing outcomes being equalised. Because, as it says in this document, it does not mean treating everyone the same or being colourblind. And the argument, certainly from the Conservatives, is everyone should be treated equally. And they argue this sort of training has led to this, even though I'm not sure we've seen sort of definitive evidence of that so far.
It just reminds me of the era of Black Lives Matter at their peak and the death of George Floyd, and of course the chilling echoes of not being able to breathe there, which is a sort of strange echo through history from this.
He said that Henry Nowak said that 9 times. Yeah. Adam, so absolutely an echo.
This idea of anti-racism, Lucy, which is not the same as disliking racism. Or thinking racism is bad. Anti-racism is actively doing things and putting policies in place and changing how your organisation works and being quite explicit about calling things out when you feel racism has occurred. And so that when Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch refer to anti-racism, they're referring to a sort of package of behaviours and things that have been deployed by the police in the wake of the George Floyd killing in America.
Yes, well, I mean, Nigel Farage referred to the George Floyd killing and said all these people that got down on one knee, sort of where are they now? And Kemi Badenoch made the point and said, we're talking about not Black Lives Matters or White Lives Matters, but all lives matter.
Which itself used to be considered a slightly racist phrase.
Yeah, because over the George Floyd killing, it was that all the Black Lives Matters, specifically in this case, because they hadn't in the past. And if you said all lives
matter, it meant that you didn't think Black Lives Mattered in that context.
That's right. So I think that pendulum has swung somewhat the other way. Obviously not for everyone, but certainly in the political conversation that has swung. And I suppose it depends how far this goes. I mean, this evening there is not a massive protest. Reporters down in Southampton say 200 to 300 people, including Tommy Robinson, outside Southampton police station. But the Police and Crime Commissioner for that area met with the Nowak family this afternoon, and in an interview with the BBC she said that the family didn't want protests across the country. So I think there has to be some care taken to bear in mind what the family wants, and not, I suppose the fear might be that this ends up, that Henry Nowak's death ends up becoming very politicised. I mean, obviously it's fine for the politicians to speak out today in the light of what has happened, but certainly the sense from the family, from what they were saying yesterday, yes, they want the answers from the police and they want to know what happened to their son and how this was allowed to happen. But yesterday they talked about not wanting that division. Today, through the the Police and Crime Commissioner. They've talked about not wanting the protests. So it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, and that was echoed by Keir Starmer in the last bit of his interview that he did, and I promised I'd play some more of it. And so here is where Keir Starmer is quoting Henry Nowak's family.
Well, I think Nigel Farage's reaction is the wrong reaction. And I start my answer to your question through the eyes of the family. They have said they do not want this whipped up. They have been through the most extraordinary, awful experience. They don't want this whipped up. And Nigel Farage is completely wrong to use this to try and create division. He would be wrong in any circumstances. But when Henry's family are saying, please don't do that, it's our son, then really, as politicians, as human beings, we should start where they start. And that's where I start.
And Joe, in terms of reactions from the Sikh community, I mean, it's never wise to just generalise about a whole group of people about what they think about something that they're actually not directly involved in, but feeling the effects of nonetheless. But there was a moment in the House of Commons today where one of the MPs who is Sikh intervened.
Yeah, Tan Desi, probably the most prominent Sikh in the House of Commons, a Labour MP who chairs the Defence Select Committee. There seemed to be tension between him and Reform UK MPs sitting opposite him, and sort of proceedings stopped for a few moments. I think Robert Jenrick was certainly there, Richard Tyson, Suella Braverman as well. I think Tan Desi talked about the indignity of Henry Nowak's final moments and how it should never happen again. But also he said it was very galling Reform UK, as well as Restore, Rupert Lowe's party, have, he said, decided to politicise people's pain by attacking the Sikh community for wearing ceremonial kirpan knives, even though that wasn't the kind of knife used in the attack. He said Reform has decided to scapegoat and throw under the bus an entire community. I'm sure that's something Reform UK might contest. But on the point of the Sikh community, it was interesting that the judge said to the murderer in this case, to Vickrum Digwa, that you have brought shame upon your family, your community and your religion. Your actions have stirred up racial tension in Southampton and across the country, which have made many Sikhs worried about their own safety, even though they have done absolutely nothing wrong.
And the family did put out a statement today. The murderer's family, they put out a statement. It was from an unnamed family member, and they said that they felt deep sorrow for the Nowak family, but in that they also said, we apologise to the Sikh community for our son's actions, which have unfairly brought the community into disrepute. But actually, a number of those family members were back in court today because there were further charges. Digwa's brother and father are facing charges for possessing offensive weapons, and they were in court today. And Digwa himself is facing further charges for possessing offensive weapons.
And we should say that that's separate legal proceedings from the trial that we've been talking about up till now.
Yeah, that's right.
Lots to think about. Lucy, thank you so much. I know you've got lots of other reporting to do tonight, so thank you.
Thank you.
And Joe, one last thing for you. We've been learning more today about Keir Starmer's WhatsApp habits. This is in the context of ministers having to hand over their Mandelson-related WhatsApps for the humble address that we were discussing at length in the previous episode of Newscast.
Exactly. And what was strange about that big document dump was that, yes, one minister, Pat McFadden, and his WhatsApps appeared a lot. But what about the Prime Minister's WhatsApps with Lord Mandelson, Rachel Reeves's, David Lammy's, who was the Foreign Secretary for a lot of this period, and the Prime Minister who appointed him? Well, Downing Street have today confirmed that Keir Starmer does use auto-delete on his WhatsApp messages, so they disappear. I'm not quite sure how long before they delete. Some people use 90 days or 7 days or even shorter. Certainly, I've been checking the WhatsApps of a lot of high-profile ministers today who do seem to have auto-delete. They have defended it, and they've said the Prime Minister has done nothing wrong. He actually said something similar, saying he's complied with the humble address. All the messages he holds have been passed over. Of course, he doesn't hold all of the messages. I went through the same process as everybody else, and many people, not just in politics, use disappearing messages. But there are wider questions and concerns about transparency of government, but also about record keeping. When big decisions are made, or there are important conversations about major government policy, there are certainly people in Westminster, Adam, who think there should be a paper trail. It's only right to have a government with a paper trail, and that's quite difficult if you have senior politicians contacting each other with disappearing messages on WhatsApp.
And Joe, as you were talking, I just checked whether you've got disappearing messages on, and you don't. And it means that I can see the last message that you sent me. Do you know what it was?
Oh, God.
It's not embarrassing, don't worry.
I don't know.
It's a recommendation for some good pub grub near Winston Churchill's old home, Chartwell. That's the kind of high-level banter Joe and I have.
But also, why as a journalist would you want deleted messages? Because you can't go back and check out what somebody said. And indeed, if you were to arrange, I don't know, a meal at a pub near Chartwell, and then it deletes, I mean, we forgot what time, we were going to meet, or what, who was coming. I mean, it's a nightmare. Why would you have deleted messages apart from to cover your tracks, some might argue.
Some might argue, says the BBC journalist. Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
Now, something very different, because earlier on today, I caught up with James Cook, the BBC Scotland editor and regular host of Newscast, because he was watching court proceedings in Edinburgh where the former chief executive of the SNP and the estranged husband of Nicola Sturgeon, Peter Murrell, was appearing. He was led in wearing handcuffs to hear this narrative, which is a device in Scottish law where the prosecution and the defence agree a sequence of events that happened when somebody has pled guilty. So in lieu of a trial where all the evidence is laid out, this is what we got instead. And a lawyer read out a quite lengthy statement where he basically said what the prosecution and the defence had agreed about Peter Murrell's embezzlement of £400,000 from the Scottish National Party over a decade. And here is the take on that from James Cook. Hello, James.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So before we get into what a Crown narrative is and what was contained therein, how was the fact that we were actually watching this being streamed live this morning from the court? How did that come about?
It's very, very unusual, and it came about because basically we, on behalf of the public, are constantly asking courts, all sorts of courts in all sorts of places, to widen access, to consider a more open approach to justice. And in fairness to the Scottish Court Service, they've been helpful, especially in this case, and they allowed us, very unusually, not unprecedented, but very unusually, to have a camera in the courtroom. I was talking to our cameraman, Andy, who shot that, and he did say, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, he did say he was a bit nervous about that shot, because it's quite a shot to get. You've only got, it's very rare to get it, a shot of someone who's pled guilty to a crime coming into the dock. Really unusual, and you wanted to make sure you got it right, and he did it beautifully.
Well, congratulations to Andy for some fine camera work as the nation was watching. And then, because we're a podcast, James, and we don't have that many pictures, paint a picture of how Peter Murrell looked and what the court was like.
I mean, the courtroom was packed. It's courtroom number 3 at the High Court in Edinburgh, just on the Lawn Market, quite near the top of the Royal Mile. It's always thronged outside with tourists and then making a lot of noise. And then inside, obviously, very, very quiet as he was led in. And the court was packed mainly with journalists, a few lawyers there as well who'd come just to have a look, some of them, to see lawyers working on other cases. I mean, not lawyers who were involved, who'd come in to see Peter Murrell being brought in. Because this case, Adam, as you know, has been, really, really covered very extensively on the BBC, not least by us newscasters, obviously be very familiar with it, and with Laura Kunsberg's interview at the weekend. So, yeah, a lot of attention, a lot of interest. And I thought he looked pretty grim as he was brought in. He stared straight ahead through much of the hearing. Once or twice he sort of puffed his cheeks, but Peter Murrell staring straight ahead. And just as these extraordinary litany of crimes was read out, and I was staring at him for most of the hearing, Adam, thinking, what were you thinking? Why did you do this? And how on earth did you think you would get away with it? With corruption on such a scale.
And even though we got lots of detail, we actually didn't get anything about what his motivation was.
Nothing. And so I think we got the how and the what today. We had a bit of the what already. We had a bit more of the how in terms of the falsification of invoices and the fact that the now infamous motorhome that he paid £125,000 of SNP funds towards. We found out a few more details about that, such as that it had only ever done 4 miles. I noticed in the picture that the Crown, the prosecution, released to us that there's a sticker on the optional television, which he chose to have added, that hadn't even been removed. It looked like it had never been used. We heard about that, and we heard a lot more detail, but we didn't get any, as you say, we didn't get any insight into why he had done this, and we will perhaps get some of that on the 23rd of June, because there's the court hearing then for sentencing. Murrell will appear at that point for sentencing, and there will be a plea in mitigation. There's also a social work report, which is standard, being carried out at the moment, and so between those two things, his defence lawyer's plea in mitigation and the social work report, maybe we'll get a glimpse and insight into his mind, because it's really, Adam, really hard to fathom, isn't it, at the moment?
And just on the camper van, I mean, there was a few things about the camper van alongside the fact that it had only been driven 4 miles. But I thought that was really interesting because there's this sort of idea has emerged that he bought it so he could go on jaunts. And the evidence for that was that after buying the camper van, he bought these guidebooks for how to have a great camper van holiday in England and Wales.
Yeah, exactly. England and Wales, and then Ireland and Scotland bought them on Amazon, I think, the next day. The prosecution were at pains to point out today, and remember, this is not contested. This is an agreed narrative. You said that at the start. It's a narrative, which is basically the point at which the prosecutor in the case reads out some of what we would have heard in evidence had he pleaded not guilty and had this gone to trial. But the point is, none of it's contested. The defence has agreed that all of the facts are facts that it accepts happened in terms of the guilty plea. So when they say that this was kitted out for pleasure and not for business, this camper van, that's accepted now by Murrell, because there was a suggestion, not least given by Nicola Sturgeon when she talked to Laura, that Murrell had said, we bought it so we could campaign around the country safely during COVID. And the prosecution were saying there was no evidence of that. There was no campaign material. There was no branding. And indeed, there were, molten brown toiletries and so on. Not that you couldn't have those while you were campaigning necessarily. But the point is there were, it looked like it had been kitted out for pleasure, as the prosecution put it.
And then you mentioned that we learned more about the techniques he used to embezzle the money. So things like using an SNP charge card to buy things that were not for the SNP, and then using his own credit card, or saying he'd used his own credit card to buy things by accident so he could then get reimbursed by the SNP.
Yeah, that's right. Claiming dodgy expenses, basically expenses to which he was not entitled. And not just using his charge card, but using charge cards, said the prosecution, in the names of 2 other SNP staff members. And to be clear, the Crown, the Advocate Depute, as he is formally known, the prosecutor, was at pains to point out that those people did not know about it, was without their knowledge. There's no suggestion that these other people in the SNP were involved, far from it, those people with the charge cards. So, he tried to cover his tracks, and for a while he did cover his tracks. And that brings us to the heart of the political row, Adam. How was it possible that he was able to get away with this for so long? Were there problems with the SNP's procedures? Were there problems with the culture within the SNP of closing down criticism and queries and concerns being raised? And they were raised. Nicola Sturgeon says, to be clear, they were not raised specifically about the idea that anyone was embezzling money, but there were concerns raised that money had gone missing. There was missing money. And then we get into a bit of a debate about, there's almost two different things going on here, because there was £600,000 or so raised directly through an appeal to party members and other donors that was supposed to be ring-fenced to spend on a future independence referendum campaign or to try to advance the cause of independence. And it seems to have been spent on day-to-day activities such as fighting a general election. And that was, I think, what initially prompted the concerns or questions about where that money had gone. But, it's the question about if that money could just come in and go out And the SNP say, well, we would have spent, that was okay. It was up and down, and we would have spent that money on the end on independence. Just the cash was flowing in and out of the party. But, had they been more curious, had they been more critical, had their procedures been more robust, could they have caught these crimes and exposed the deceit at the heart of these crimes earlier? Many of their critics say they could have. And indeed, John Swinney, the current First Minister and SNP leader, says, sort of almost implicitly acknowledges that, because he says, I have tightened up the governance of the party since then. I have made improvements in terms of how many people have to approve accounts, in terms of the who can report, and in terms of, he actually said today, which I thought was quite striking, he said something along the lines of, now if people come forward with complaints, they'll be taken seriously. I paraphrase, it was words to that effect, but I mean, the implication was they hadn't been before.
And also, there was a little insight into what Nicola Sturgeon was saying about how much he'd covered his tracks. So, for example, there was this a few times he would buy things and then claim that they were things like studio lighting, presumably for the SNP's HQ, so they could film videos and stuff. He would then put in a false entry on the SNP's register of its assets, of stuff that it owned, labelled lighting, but for lights that never existed, because he used that money for something else.
Exactly.
And then he backed it up with a false invoice from the lighting company.
Yeah, there was lots of that, false invoices and lies in the SNP computer system. Let me give you another couple of examples, and I will have to look at notes for these because there are so many, more than 1,000 items, but just one at each end of the scale, which I think gives you a degree, extent of the scope. He spent around £9,000 on the purchase of 2 Bremont watches. I must say, I'm not familiar with Bremont watches, Adam. Maybe you are. But
No, me neither.
I wasn't, but they were expensive anyway. About $4,500.
My watch tastes are much more humble than that.
Yeah,
just to be clear.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Mine too. Anyway, these 2 Bremont watches, he recorded them as event merchandise, and then right at the other end of the scale, he entered a £23.98 silicone egg poacher in the accounting software as Ethernet cabling. So, there's just a couple of examples at either ends of the scale.
And for people who don't remember Ethernet cables, because we don't use them very much, they're the cables that you plug into to get the internet through the wall, rather than using Wi-Fi.
I think so, yeah.
It's a very
when they
Adam Fleming University era tech. And so, anything else that struck out from this narrative?
The library, the home library.
Oh, yes. Including like a ladder.
Yeah, included a £953 wooden ladder in this very expensive fitted home library paid for by SNP cash, which we have pictures of thanks to Nicola Sturgeon's social media accounts. And that, what they told us about that today was that they'd removed some things from the house, such as a £3,500 silver wine coaster, which blows my mind because that seems a lot of money for a wine coaster, but it looked quite complex and weird. But even so, I mean, it seems a lot of money to put your drink down. Just get a wee mat. Anyway, they removed some things, including the coaster, but they could presumably really decided they couldn't remove or weren't going to remove an entire library. Although, so that's still there. And that gets into another question, which is proceeds of crime, because there will be a process now to try to recover some of the money. The police, I thought this was interesting, that the prosecutors said the police had not recovered a majority of the items that were that the embezzled money was spent on. So they have less than half of the whole haul, and there will now be a process to try to recover money, and presumably there's going to, I imagine there'll be a degree of argument about that. I mean, the couple, Peter Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon, they're estranged now, and she insists she was deceived, lied to, says, as we know in Laura's interview, that she knew absolutely nothing about this. But there's going to be a bun fight, I think, over assets to try to recover money.
And even the idea of that seemed to come as quite a shock to Nicola Sturgeon when Laura raised it to her.
Well, I thought it was interesting. Yeah, Laura raised the idea of the house, and Nicola Sturgeon was. I thought that was the point at which she pushed back most against Laura in that interview, where she said. She basically said, why should I? Why should I give up things that were mine? But I think that's the whole point. And that's why Laura asked the question, because there's going to be a lot of debate about what is yours and what's his and how it's divided and what are marital assets and what are joint assets. I mean, I'm no expert in that, but it sounds like that's going to be a nightmare.
What's the status of something that was bought with embezzled goods, so bought fraudulently, and then given as a gift to somebody who you're not divorced from yet?
I mean,
that's what the lawyers have to work out.
I was going to try to answer that, but then I decided it's probably better not
Yeah.
to. So I mean, embezzled goods are embezzled goods, aren't they? But I'm not a lawyer.
The other big learning for me from this is just how much luxury stuff you can buy if you've got loads of money. So the BBC has got this thing on the website where it's a searchable list of things that Peter Murrell bought, the hundreds and hundreds of things. And the thing that kind of blows my mind is a thing called a cup warmer. So I looked into this. Yeah. This is basically that if you've got a posh coffee machine, they recommend that you don't get the coffee to straight into a room temperature mug because that's bad for the coffee. So you can buy a mug warmer that warms your mug so it's the right temperature to receive the coffee from the spout of the coffee machine. And he bought several of them, and 2 of them cost £363.14.
And I think a political problem here for the SNP is the extent to which Nicola Sturgeon is leaning into this idea of we were not a normal household, we had loads of money, it wasn't suspicious because we were so... She doesn't say we were so rich, but that's what she means. And for a party, it's just interesting. I cannot imagine if she were in office that I just think that's easier for her to say out of office than it would be in office for a party of the left, a party that proudly proclaims its concern for reducing poverty. Because it's very striking. Now, perhaps, in fairness, perhaps perhaps it's just nonsense for politicians to pretend that they are, we're of the people, and we're maybe most politicians are earning considerably more than the average wage. But I think the political messaging there is quite striking, and you can't imagine that she'd be happy with that if she were in office. But that's interesting because there's a lot of people asking lots of questions about Nicola Sturgeon here, but she has it's not like she's going to be forced from office. I'm not quite sure what people think is going to happen. The police have investigated her and decided there was not the evidence to charge her, and she was released without charge. So I'm not sure what those who are sort of loudly calling for criticising Nicola Sturgeon, I don't see what will happen to her or what they want to happen to her necessarily. Whereas John Swinney, it's different. He's in office and he is still facing loud calls for some sort of inquiry. I spoke to the former First Minister, Labour's Jack McConnell, this morning, who wants a joint parliamentary inquiry, which has never happened before, of Holyrood and Westminster together to look into the issues surrounding this case.
Well, James, I will let you move on to prepare your piece for the 6 o'clock news, which will be very avidly watched by many millions of people. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. A reminder, you can listen to us as a podcast every single day of the week, and we are available to download on BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.